It's really nice to be able to give a talk where I don't have to get on an airplane and to do it sort of in the neighborhood. So again, thank you very much for the invitation to come and address you today. And I want to start essentially by making no apologies for the title of the book. Because if any of you have known a soil scientist or taken a soil science class, you probably, as I learned in that class, know that you're never, ever, ever supposed to call soil dirt. It's the one thing you're just not supposed to call it for a soil scientist, which is, of course, why I called the book Dirt. And the guy who taught me soil science at least got the joke, and he's forgiven me for it. One very senior colleague, however, has never forgiven me and probably never will, because it is a cardinal sin. But the real point of the title is that you can think of soil as probably our most fundamental resource, but very few people really think of soil as a strategic resource. We tend to take the earth beneath our feet for granted. And I'm a geologist, the kind of geologist that's known as a geomorphologist. I study topography, what shapes the surface of the earth. And most people really think of the surface of the earth as something that's sort of unchanging. But to somebody like me, it's evolving, it's dynamic, it's changing all the time. And soil is essentially the thin, fragile skin of the earth that separates the realm of the geological from the world that we know and the biological. And you can think of soil, quite literally, as that medium in which the geological and the biological interact, and it's a catalyst for supporting life on the planet outside of the oceans. And this book is really an attempt to try and extend to a broader audience beyond the world of soil scientists and geologists understanding and knowledge of the importance and value of soils to societies when you think about societies over the long run, like geologists do. I'm trained to think that a century is a blink of an eye in terms of the life of the earth. It's virtually our whole lifetime. But when you think about the land over long time periods, the value of the soil and its relationship to societies really becomes clear. So I want to share with you over the next few minutes some of the background from the book, walk you through a couple of the examples, but then also to try and transition to sort of a new project, a follow-up project that I want to advertise at the end because of things I learned along the journey of actually preparing this study of soil as a strategic resource, if you will. But I want to start by, if you've read environmental histories, you've probably run into the idea that environmental influences and soil erosion resulting from deforestation in particular have been proposed to explain the demise of civilizations around the world. All those societies up there in the upper right-hand corner of the screen are places where people have made this argument in environmental history textbooks. And as a geologist who's worked primarily throughout a lot of my career in steep upland forested landscapes, places where forest management or deforestation have occurred in different parts of the world, I've sort of recognized that there's a fundamental problem with the timescales in terms of trying to simply blame the kind of erosion that we can document in ancient societies on the simple act of deforestation. Why? Well, it's because trees grow back pretty fast. I cut my geological teeth in the Oregon Coast Range, a place where after one clear cuts, if you come back within 15 years, there's trees taller than your head, already back and established. The window for causing erosion right after deforestation or just sort of clearing of a hillside, even if you're going to let it grow back, is a fairly narrow window. And if you run the numbers, as I have for the Oregon Coast Range, you can demonstrate that clear cutting on steep slopes will accelerate the rate of landsliding. But it's not sustained for long enough to actually pencil out to result in wholesale loss of the soil because of the trees growing back fast enough. So what I wanted to ask is a different question in framing this study, and that's, could agricultural soil erosion limit the lifespan of civilizations? Could it have been the plow and not the axe that was essentially the culprit in the loss of soil that we can document in ancient societies? Now, if we recognize that most of our food, something like 97% of it, comes from the soil, either directly or indirectly, the fundamental condition for sustaining a civilization, an agricultural civilization, becomes sustaining the soil. There's certainly examples of societies around the world, in particular native cultures in this region, where they were sustained essentially using marine resources. Salmon was an incredible resource, and a long-lived sustainable society was developed in this region, as in Europe and in New England as well. But if you look globally, we're a species that primarily eats plants or things that ate plants, things that directly or indirectly came from the soil. And marine resources constitute about 3% of our diet. And therefore, if we look at what it would take to actually sustain a society over a time frame that a geologist would consider to be sustainable, and geologists are kind of, we're a bit particular about time. We like to think about it in a long time frame. But if you think about what it would take to sustain a society over the long time frame, it's sustaining the soil itself. Sustaining soil fertility is obviously also a very important issue. I'm not going to talk a lot about that today. I talk a fair bit about that in the book, as some of you, I'm sure, recall. But in the interest of not sort of talking until midnight tonight, we're going to focus on preserving the soil itself as a physical body. And also because I'm a geologist. That's the part where I started on this. But I want to make first some caveats of things I'm not trying to say in this book. And I'm not trying to make essentially an environmentally deterministic argument that sort of geography is destiny. Indeed, I'm not trying to discount the role of politics, social evolution, and historical context in the course, shape, and fate of human societies. Every society has a unique historical and social setting and specific social contexts that lead to warfare and institutional evolution and crises. And I'm not trying to discount the human dimension of these problems. In fact, I think where you'll see where I'm going by the end of the talk is that I'm trying to argue that it's the way that people treat land in their coupled social, cultural, and economic systems that in the end set up how long the land can support human societies. The human dimension, in other words, is central to the problem. Secondarily, I want to advertise I'm not trying to argue that climate change is not a major influence on the health, course, and longevity of human societies. The Viking colony in Greenland that disappeared during the cold snap of the Little Ice Age from the 1500s to the 1700s is sort of the poster child of societies that were vanished due to climatic variability. And I'm not trying to argue that climate change is not one of the major problems that we're facing today, and I'm not trying to argue that it hasn't influenced ancient societies. Some of the dynasties on the Nile River in Egypt that vanished as a result of extended droughts are another good example of societies that were vulnerable to climate changes. And finally, the third caveat that I want to offer, before explaining why I'm offering all these caveats at the start of a talk, is that natural disasters, I'm not trying to argue that natural disasters can't limit the longevity of human societies. Volcanoes, earthquakes, and floods can take out small societies in particular, but if you think about the problem of vulnerability to natural disasters, there's a scale dependence to human society's vulnerability to natural disasters. If you live on a small island state, like the Bronze Age society of the Minoans who lived on the island of Santorini, a volcanic island in the Mediterranean, they disappeared overnight when their homeland literally erupted beneath their feet, a lot like Mount St. Helens up there in the upper right-hand corner of this slide. And they were very vulnerable. Why did they actually build their society on an active volcano? Well, they had the best sort of geothermally heated hot water plumbing system in the Bronze Age world. And if you think back 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, running hot water was an incredible luxury. But building on an active volcano made them very vulnerable. When the volcano blew up, their society crumbled. The point of these caveats is that there's no particular time scale to the longevity of a human society that would be predicted by either climate changes, natural disasters, or politics and social evolution. There's no sort of inherent rhythm that would lead you to expect societies to last any particular time frame. But if you look at that, the sort of the archaeological record around the world through the thick, fuzzy glasses of a geologist looking at human problems, major civilizations last on the order of about 1,000 years. 500 to 2,000 years, geologists like to tend to deal in factors of 2 being about the same. That's order of magnitude about 1,000 years, with some key exceptions. And those tend to be the major civilizations that were developed along floodplain rivers. The ones on the Tigris and Euphrates, where agriculture developed, along the Nile, the rivers of northern China. Those are places where essentially the soils are refertilized by annual flooding. Floodplains make incredible agricultural soils because erosion off the uplands delivers fresh soil and renews soil fertility year after year during the flooding phase. The societies that have lasted the longest, the exceptions to this sort of gross generality in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, are major places where essentially floodplain agriculture was practiced over the long run. The problems that Egypt ran into when they essentially cut the supply of silt from Ethiopia off by building the Aswan Dam are perhaps beyond the scope of the lecture today. But I wanted to basically point out, whoops, I got that thing set up to go too fast, so we'll go back to here. Basically want to point out that there's no particular time scale implied by the typical ideas that people use to invoke the lifespan, what controls the lifespan of societies. So what I wanted to investigate was, could agricultural soil erosion effectively set the limit to how long people can use the land? Now, there's both bad news and then ultimately good news that will come from that view of things, because obviously writing a book with this title and presenting a talk like this today, the answer is yes. But there is good news at the end of it. So I want to invite, the slide that just flashed by basically shows that there's many societies that in which the connection between soil erosion and then the ultimate decline of that society has been hypothesized, talked about, or at least sort of looked at as a coincidence in time. I'll show you a couple examples of that as we go through the lecture. But first I want to invite you to think about soils the way a geologist like myself does. Soils are a system. They're produced from the weathering of rocks. Rocks break down, and essentially to form either secondary minerals or smaller bits of the primary minerals, they break down. They get mixed with biological material, both living and dead, decaying organic matter and life in the soil. And that mixing creates soils on hillsides that essentially is that thin skin of the earth, the mix of the biological and the geological. And on any type of a hill slope, if you're on any kind of a slope, you can imagine that soil is moving down slope at some rate. It's eroding. If there's any kind of slope to the surface, even the 1-degree slopes of the sort of fields in Nebraska, soil is gradually moving down slope as rain moves individual particles, as people's boots kick stuff as they go by, or as cows walk over it. The soil is moving down slope as long as there's a slope. What this means is that you can think of the soil as reflecting a balance between the rate at which rocks break down and mix with organic matter to make new soil, and the rate at which soil's eroded off the landscape. And if you think about soil that way, you can kind of think about it much like your own bank account. You have income. There's the weathering of rocks to make soil. It's analogous to your income. You've got expenses. That's essentially erosion coming off the hillsides. And you've got savings. That's the amount that's actually of soil that's stored on the hillside. And we all know, and I know all too well since I've done this several times, that if you spend money faster than you make it, you can drive your savings down to zero and go broke. It's a fairly simple system. Input minus output equals change in storage. Spend money faster than you make it for long enough, and you run out of savings. Soil, it turns out, is no different. It's fairly similar if you think about it as a system in that way. If soils erode for long enough at a pace faster than they're being remade, the soil will thin. Do that for long enough and it can thin enough to really crimp agricultural production. That said, though, this cartoon here is out of one of my journal papers. It's meant to simply illustrate that we can model these kinds of connections and processes, and we can actually argue all day about what the appropriate form of a model for looking at a soil production function is. That's not my intent here. What I want to advertise, you can do that, and you can spend sort of half a career arguing about it. But at the simplest level, we can think about soils as that simple system of things that are produced, lost, and stored. And if we do, up in the upper right-hand corner, we can, there's a couple things that essentially come straight out. One is that under native vegetation, a typical soil thickness will develop that reflects all the factors influencing the weathering of soil and the erosion of soil. The local climate, the vegetation, the topography, the geology. Are the rocks hard or weak? Is the slope steep or low or gentle? Is the vegetation grass or trees? These things all matter, and soils are one of the most varied and diverse natural resources we have. There's something like 200,000 different kinds of soils that have been identified and named on this planet. And one of the reasons I'm probably not a soil scientist is I can't remember that many names, let alone that many names in Latin. But this simple idea that over time the change in soil thickness will be the result of the net difference between soil production and soil loss is a very simple generality. And exploring that generality in the history of human societies is essentially what I was trying to do with this book. And I want to point out that many of the ideas in this book are not novel, new ideas. I'm not trying to take credit for sort of a great insight into sort of a new way of looking at things. In fact, as I'll show you, it's a very old way of looking at things. There's a guy named John Playfair in 1802 who essentially recognized that soils will develop to sort of a typical soil thickness that reflects the local environmental conditions when he wrote in the book that essentially founded the modern discipline of geomorphology. That, in his words, in the permanence of a coat of vegetable mold on the surface of the earth, and vegetable mold was the early 19th century term for soil for some reason. In the permanence of a coat of vegetable mold on the surface of the earth, we have a demonstrative proof of the continual destruction of the rocks, and cannot but admire the skill with which the powers of the many chemical and mechanical agents employed in this complicated work are so adjusted as to make the supply and the waste of the soil exactly equal to one another. Playfair was sort of recognizing in that wonderfully beautiful 19th century writing where a sentence goes on for several pages, that the soil is a dynamic, self-maintaining system. You leave it alone long enough, and it comes into an equilibrium with the kind of vegetation and climate and rocks and topography that exist in an area. And that will be different depending on where you are. But he explicitly said that if you came back every 1,000 years, somehow figured out how to do that, and dug a trench along a hillside, you'd find about the same soil thickness every time you came back, even though a lot of rocks were broken down and turned into new soil, and that soil was eroded downstream and sent off on its way towards the ocean. The soil is a dynamic, self-maintaining system. Well, the invention of the plow fundamentally altered the balance between soil production and soil erosion. Why? Well, think about it. What does a plow do? It turns the surface over. It leaves the ground bare for some part of the year. That's half of its point. It's to essentially help it sort of defeat the weeds that come back early, because as a farmer, you want essentially your crops to have the head start and everything else. But if you go out and look around most natural landscapes around the world, there's very little bare ground. The places where you find that are up on the Tibetan Plateau, on the high altiplano, really arid areas. You go out under a forest or a grassland, there's very little bare earth. And bare earth is very vulnerable to erosion by wind or rain, unless it's really hard rock and has no soil on it in the first place, in which case you've played all the way through and it's a whole different issue. But the plow essentially has accelerated erosion by anywhere from a factor of several-fold to a factor of several tens of fold, several orders of magnitude, in the studies that have actually addressed it. And that this sort of iconic act of farming has actually resulted in tremendous erosion over centuries in many places around the world. It's one of the basic messages of this book. I want to start with an example of the Greek landscape. Why the Greek landscape? Well, because Tjeerd Van Andel and Chris Reynolds did a tremendous job of compiling the data and doing the fundamental studies for it. One of the real elements of a book like this, where you're trying to synthesize things not only in one's own discipline but to other disciplines, is you try and find people who've done a really good job of doing studies that you can basically synthesize and relate to other things, because no one person could do the fundamental studies in all these areas. So what did they find in Greece? Well, they found that essentially cycles of erosion and soil formation in ancient Greece began with the Bronze Age erosion event right after the introduction of plow-based agriculture. When the plow arrived from points east and made it to the Greek peninsula, the soils of central and southern Greece literally started eroding off the hills and down into the valley bottoms back in the Bronze Age, several thousand years before the time of Christ. What did the landscape look like in about that region? Well, Van Andel and Reynolds essentially offered the next couple figures, and essentially this is their reconstruction of the Greek landscape sort of immediately after glaciation. It was an open oak woodland. That sort of vertical dash hatchering stuff right below the little trees there is meant to represent about a 1 to 3 foot thick soil that covered the hillsides in the region. And that as agriculture spread up onto the hillsides, essentially much of the landscape was fully cultivated during the Bronze Age, and then, as I'll show in a minute, again during the Classical Age of Greece. And so plowing essentially spread right on up the hillsides. What happened is essentially that over time they argued that the soils of central Greece were eroded off down into the valley bottoms, and you were left with bare rocky hillsides on which you can still find Bronze Age agricultural implements in places where you couldn't possibly grow wheat today. Their reconstruction suggested that a lot of the soil from the hillsides ended up in the valley bottoms. And you could argue, well, what's the problem with that? You still have almost the same amount of soil in the landscape. But if you think about the act of farming, it doesn't really depend on the volume of soil you have in a landscape. It's critically dependent on the surface area of the soil. And if you essentially take something that was a thin sheet over much of the landscape and you pile it all up in the valley bottoms, you've restricted the total area that you can farm. And you see, one thing you see in society after society around the world is that farming will often start in the valley bottoms. Why? Well, because it's relatively easily worked land where the water is delivered to you because it's on a floodplain. And they're very fertile soils because deposition of material brought in by the annual flood replenishes soil fertility year after year. Hillsides are a different story. But once the population farming valley bottoms gets larger, farming tends to expand up into the hillsides, populations keep growing, and the clock literally starts running on erosional processes like we saw in classical Greece that thin the soils in the uplands to the point where eventually you'd have a hard time farming them. But if you have a population that essentially is set by the ability to farm the whole landscape and then eventually you're not able to farm as much, it's a recipe for essentially a population overshoot. Now, there's not a lot of societies that have essentially experienced several rounds of civilization in the same landscape. Greece is one of them where not only has that happened, but it's been well studied. Van Andel and Runnels essentially made estimates of the population density of the southern Argolid, part of the southern Greek landscape, of how many people were supported in the landscape over time, running from about 6,000 BC over there on the left to about the modern world on the right. And what you essentially see are 3 cycles of a population run up in the Bronze Age, a crash in a dark age before the age of classical Greece, another population spike, and then a crash in the dark age before the modern world. Sort of 3 cycles. And there's 2 aspects to this curve that I think are really, that are striking. One is essentially the range in amplitude. In the Bronze Age, you can only support a few people per hectare of land. In the modern age, you can support far more per unit area of land. And there's not a lot of mystery to that. Technology can actually explain that pretty well. People with essentially digging sticks and very little technology in the Bronze Age aren't able to grow as much food as people can today with John Deere tractors and nitrogen-based fertilizers and all the accoutrements of modern agriculture. Technology can really explain the amplitude change, I think, fairly simply, clearly, and obviously. But what sets the periodicity? Why 3 cycles of run-up, crash, run-up, crash, run-up, and what's going to happen next? That's the part that actually got me really interested in this particular graph and thinking about the relationship of long-term implications of plow-based farming, what I'll probably lapse into calling conventional farming along the way in the talk, and the implications of that for the course and fate and longevity of human societies. Well, the idea that the way people treat land determines the way the land can treat people, again, is not a new idea. Some of the oldest literature we have in the Western world, Plato, addresses this problem fairly explicitly, a little cryptically, but in his words, several centuries BC, he wrote that the rich, soft soil has all run away, leaving the land nothing but skin and bone. He was describing the landscape around his native Athens. But in those days, the damage had not taken place. The hills had high crests, the rocky plain of Phelos was covered with rich soil, and the mountains were covered by thick woods, of which there are some traces today. He was essentially describing the Bronze Age erosion event in the Greek landscape, recognizing the pattern where he would find trees around people's fields that were on pedestals of soil with most of the soil in the fields eroded away. And he was complaining explicitly about the inability of the land, the Greek landscape, to support the kinds of armies that Greek had in the ancient days. Now, whether that was actually true or not, he was essentially recognizing some of the signs of the Bronze Age erosion event. And he got the timing right. Said it was a couple thousand years before his own time, but nobody believed him until very recently, several decades ago. Why? Well, in part because he wrote about it in his dialogue on the history of Atlantis. And that's not really recognized as one of the most fundamentally sound scientific sources from the ancient world. But he deserves more credit, perhaps, than he's been given over time. Well, there's a lot of other societies I could talk about in the interim, and those of you who are reading or have read the book sort of know that sort of all the stuff that I'm glossing over between the Greeks and talking about colonial America and United States agriculture. The Roman Empire, the Chinese, many very interesting examples. But in the interest of time, forgive me for that. That is, after all, why you write a book. You can put it all in there. But so let's talk about colonial America and American agriculture for a few minutes, because the evolution of American agriculture is actually really interesting. I thought I was writing a book about soil erosion per se. It was as much about the evolution of agriculture and the way that influenced the course of history as it was about simply the process of soil erosion. Well, the Jamestown colony in Virginia was essentially started as an investment for London investment bankers. It was needed to return a profit to stay in business and keep goods going both ways across the ocean that would keep the colonists in business. What worked was tobacco. They tried all kinds of things. They tried making beer. They tried cutting timber down. Tobacco worked. Why did tobacco work? To keep the colony afloat and then essentially grow the colonies to eventually become the collection of colonies that became our country? Well, it worked because tobacco could survive being shipped back to England, and the European public was starting to become addicted to tobacco, and the Spanish owned the monopoly on tobacco production. The English crown wanted in on the action, and it was essentially very profitable to grow tobacco. It worked to keep everything going, and the British crown literally ran their empire for about a century on that before tea took over and the little things like the American Revolution got in the way of their plans. But why do I bring this up? Because colonial agriculture was very erosive. You could get about 3 to 5 years of crops, of profitable crops out of tobacco, the way it was grown in the southeast, before you essentially needed to move on and clear new land. And the quote that I'll let you read for yourselves up there in terms essentially talks about how the pattern of farming in the colonial land was to grow stuff for a few years, and before the stumps rotted out, you'd be clearing new land because that's what you needed to essentially continue the very profitable tobacco production. That's led to the rise of plantation agriculture. agriculture because you needed a large amount of land to actually be able to operate on a little bit of it for just a few years and keep moving it around. And this era, the 17th, 18th century, really led to the development of very different paths in thinking about soil stewardship in Europe and North America for fairly simple reasons. In Europe, land was expensive, labor was cheap. They were exporting people like my ancestors about as fast as they could kick us out, and consolidating land into smaller, larger holdings, and people were essentially thinking about how do you reinvest in the soil? How do you deal with crop rotations? How do you deal with returning organic matter? How do you set livestock up to return manure to the land? There was a lot of innovations in thinking about how to maintain soil fertility. In North America, on the other hand, land was cheap. You just cleared more and moved farther into the continent and took it. And labor was the expensive part of the equation. And so there was very little essential development of soil husbandry. It didn't really figure in terribly much to the early days of colonial American agriculture. This was recognized at the highest levels of American society as something that might not be in the country's long-term best interest. George Washington, for example, in a 1796 letter to Alexander Hamilton, wrote about the problem of failure to take care of farmland under colonial agriculture when he wrote that a few years more of increased sterility will drive the inhabitants of the Atlantic states westward for support, whereas if they were taught how to improve the old instead of going in pursuit of new and productive soils, they would make these acres which now scarcely yield them anything turn out beneficial to themselves. Washington was essentially arguing that the future of the United States lay in westward expansion, not because of a manifest destiny to colonize an uncivilized continent, but simply because the farmers of the eastern seaboard were plowing through their soils fast enough that we were going to be compelled to cross the Appalachians to keep farming, and we were an agricultural society. He was very concerned about the potential effect on American society. How extensive was the problem of soil erosion in the American Southeast? Well, this map essentially shows you the answer. It's a little cryptic. It basically shows a noodle ranging from Virginia up there in the upper right to Alabama in the lower left. And the colored area is the Piedmont. It's the upland area. It's not the coastal plains. It's not the Appalachians. It's the upland area that was extensively farmed in colonial days. And that gray color corresponds to 4 to 10 inches of topsoil loss. The black, more than 10 inches. Was that a little or a lot? There was only 12 inches of topsoil originally on this landscape when European colonists first arrived. So if we were able to plow through the soils and erode off the soils of the Southeast, a third to more than 2/3 of them in just a couple centuries, it gives you a bit of perspective on what the Greeks could have done with a 1,000-year run at it, or the Romans with 1,500 years in central Italy, or the Mayans with 1,500 years in Central America, or the Polynesians on Easter Island with a 1,000-year run at it. Because the basic technology of the plow hasn't changed all that much in thousands of years, and the basic idea that soils exposed to wind and rain erode faster than if they're covered by vegetation has been true, well, since the dawn of life, for about 400 million years in terms of life on the continents. Well, the soil erosion that occurred in colonial North America did not occur because of ignorance of soil conservation practices. In the aftermath of the Dust Bowl, which I'll talk about in a moment, albeit very briefly, there was a review of what could be done to essentially reduce soil loss off of American farms. And the review came up with, well, this idea by this guy named Hall over there on the right, was that most of the erosion control practices that were available in the 1930s, his time, were either developed by the Virginia farmers or became known to them during the first half of the 19th century. In other words, almost all the ideas that were brought forward as to how to prevent a second Dust Bowl were known to George Washington and his associates back in the late 18th and early 19th century. So the problem of soil erosion in eastern North America was not that people weren't aware of it, and it was not that people didn't know how to stop it. It's that they didn't do it. Well, you might ask the question of why would an agricultural nation essentially engage collectively in processes that would essentially undercut the very resource that was essentially key to their survival. And a sociologist named Anthony Craven, I think, hit the nail on the head in 1925 when he wrote that men may, because of ignorance or habit, ruin their soils, but more often economic or social conditions entirely outside their control lead or force them to a treatment of their lands that can end only in ruin. In other words, farmers can become trapped in economic or social contexts that essentially prevent them from taking care of the land in the short run because they have other priorities. If you need to maximize return, short-term return on investment to either pay off the farm, pay off machinery, pay off agricultural chemicals that you're using, those incentives can actually be much stronger than the long-term incentive of essentially preserving the soil, particularly when, as I'll show you in a moment, the long-term rate of soil loss, if you just average over techniques and over continents, is on the order of about 1 millimeter a year. It's really slow. Hard to get really excited about something that happens, far slower than your fingernails grow. Well, the Dust Bowl essentially really put soil erosion on the map in the United States in terms of public policy. It led to the development of the Soil Conservation Service, the first governmental organization dedicated to preservation of the soil. And I'm going to reduce the Dust Bowl to essentially this single figure, which is not really doing it justice. But when Hugh Bennett, the first chief of the Soil Conservation Service in 1941, was asked about sort of what it took to get his agency established, he wrote that, "I suspect that when people along the seaboard of the eastern United States began to taste fresh soil from the plains 2,000 miles away, many of them realized for the first time that somewhere, something had gone wrong with the land. You weren't supposed to be tasting the soil of Nebraska on your bagel in New York City. It was just people." When the clouds of dust essentially made it off the Midwest and hit the population centers on the eastern seaboard, it really got people's attention. And this has led to the establishment of the Soil Conservation Service. But I want to quickly disabuse you of the notion that establishing the Soil Conservation Service solved the problem of soil erosion in the United States. Now, this is not to denigrate their agency. They've done tremendous work. They've probably reduced the rate of soil erosion on a national level by about a factor of 4 in the last 50 years. The problem is, as I'll show you, is that it was out by about a factor of 20. There's still work to do. This is a slide of a wheat field in the Palouse over in eastern Washington from the 1970s. It's about 40 years after the establishment of the Soil Conservation Service, and it illustrates the problem with plow-based agriculture as a geologist like myself would see it. And that's all those little channels. They're things that a geologist would call a rill. You can plow right over them, you can walk right over them, you can probably fill half of those in with your shoe if you just kicked it around. And they can be an inconvenience to agriculture, but they're not necessarily an impediment. But those sort of little rills, things that could only be a half inch, maybe an inch deep a year, really add up if they're happening year after year after year. And this essentially illustrates the problem of what happens in a winter wheat field if you get rainfall at the time when it's not covered with crops after it's been plowed. This is the slide that essentially shows how much it adds up. That fence up there in the upper right, it's also from the Palouse, but that fence in the upper right surrounds a water cistern the farmer built in 1911 when this field was first plowed. You'll notice that orange line at 1911 is the original ground surface. The one down at the bottom that says 1961 is the ground surface at the bottom of the cliff that had then formed around the water cistern over the course of 50 years. And that little black thing to the right of the 1961 sticking up vertically, that's a 1-foot increment on a survey rod that doesn't show up very well in the negative. But if you scale that, it sees 5 feet of soil loss in 50 years. That's about a foot a decade. That's about an inch a year. Yeah, more or less. Soils just don't form that fast anywhere on the planet. And it illustrates very well the problem with long-term soil erosion under conventional plow-based agriculture. Is it an extreme example? Well, yes, obviously. That's why I'm using it. But by some estimates, the farming in the Palouse has resulted in the loss of half the topsoil in the region in the last 100 years. That's right on track for what happened in the eastern seaboard. And by the way, the population in the Piedmont of the eastern seaboard greatly emptied out in the middle of the 19th century in the wake of all the erosion that was happening there. Not that I'm predicting that for eastern Washington. But so in researching this book, I basically looked at the examples you could find from ancient societies in the archaeological literature, the historical literature, read Roman agricultural literature, read the Greek agricultural literature. But what you don't have from ancient societies is actual data from people measuring rates of soil loss off of fields. There weren't geomorphologists in the Roman Empire going out and actually measuring the sediment flux in rivers. So I did the thing I wanted to, in compiling this book, that I wanted to do as a scientist, and that's actually compile the numbers, crunch the numbers, and figure out whether or not agricultural soil erosion, given the data that we have today, actually pencils out as something that we could point to as the culprit in the loss of soils that plagued ancient societies, whether it indeed was the plow and not the axe that was the villain of that tale looked at that way. And so I did something that has become, I guess, increasingly out of fashion. I went to the library And I went there for 3 weeks, and I just got every scrap of data I could find on what are erosion rates under contemporary agricultural practices, and also what are erosion rates under native vegetation, long-term geological erosion rates, because if you recall John Playfair's argument, the long-term erosion rate in the landscape is going to be about equal to the long-term soil erosion rate. And essentially what I came up with is this graph. Why did I spend 3 weeks in the library doing it? Well, it was all the time I had in the summer, and there's a deadline in the book, and it was due, and after that, my students came back, and I was back in the classroom. It was the window I had. One could compile 4 times as much data if one had the time to do it. But I think it's pretty representative. I found about 1,400 different studies that reported measurements of agricultural and geological erosion rates, and this graph shows you the results. It's a one-dimensional graph, so it's just erosion rate across the bottom. You'll notice that it ranges over 7 orders of magnitude, and it's a logarithmic scale, so it's a log cycles of 10. Erosion rates are incredibly variable, ranging from a 10,000th of a millimeter a year over on the left-hand side. You know, I defy you to figure out a way to measure that directly. It's incredibly slow. Over on the far right-hand side, the highest rates on the order of about 10 millimeters a year, a centimeter a year. That's still not terribly fast. But that's what you get in the planet. Those three white sets of data, the cratons, the soil mantled areas, and the alpine and glaciated terrain, are 3 different geological environments. And so the open data points are all long-term geological erosion rate data. And a craton is not a very normal word. It's a geological word for a flat, dead part of a continent. So when you see craton, think the American Midwest, think Australia, think southern India, think much of Africa outside of the rift zone. And they erode at rates less than about 100th of a millimeter a year. The soil mantled terrain, that's like the rolling hills of California. It's like a lot of the area around Puget Sound. They erode at rates less than about a millimeter a year. Now these areas, the cratons and soil mantled terrain, those are the areas we tend to farm. The high alpine and glaciated terrain over there on the right-hand side, that's like the Himalaya, the European Alps, the Andes, the high Cascades, places where there's not much soil, frankly, for the most part, and that erode at rates of about a millimeter a year or higher on average. And we don't tend to farm high alpine and glaciated terrain. The people who do are people who have no other terrain to farm. And look at where conventional agriculture plots, all those black data points sitting up there in the upper right-hand corner. It essentially plots virtually on top of the alpine and glaciated terrain. And what I've done here is compiled agricultural erosion rates for conventional plow-based agriculture, and it ranges from agriculture in the developing world to the most modern technologically advanced farms in the United States. It's a huge range of data. But there's 2 conclusions that essentially come fairly readily from this fairly simple compilation. The first is that modern farms, conventional farms, are eroding like alpine topography. It's essentially the correspondence between the 2 data sets in the upper right-hand side. We've managed at a global level, at this fairly crude level of comparison, to convert landscapes that are like the American Midwest into places that are eroding like the high Himalaya. That really is quite a trick when you think about it. The problem, of course, is that it's still only at about a rate of a millimeter a year or so. Fairly slow by anyone's standard other than a geologist. And secondarily, what that red line is that I've now added to the figure, that's the USDA's definition of the soil loss tolerance values that define sustainable agriculture. They range from about 0.4 to 1 millimeter a year. And sustainable agriculture is defined as, if you have erosion rates that are no more than that, it's defined as sustainable by the USDA. The point I want to make is that's the far right-hand side of the long-term erosion rates for any place we actually farm, the soil mantled terrain and the cratons. In other words, conventional plow-based agriculture is unsustainable in soil mantled landscapes, whatever USDA's definition is notwithstanding. That actually should be a very troubling conclusion to come to. This graph, though, has the good news buried within it. It's the most complicated one I'll show. It's a 2-axis graph. The x-axis in this case is a percentile plot. So I'm just showing you the distribution of all the data in the data that I showed you before, plus a few new data sets. The erosion rate now is on the y-axis, so that red bar going across, that's those USDA soil loss tolerance values again. And what I've shown here is, in the black lines, those are the 2 data sets I've already shown you. The geological erosion data are the lower one. The conventional plow-based agriculture is the upper one. But those 3 data sets that plot virtually on top of the geological erosion data set, that's where the good news lies. Because those are data on long-term rates of soil production, the open circles, long-term erosion rates under native vegetation, the open triangles, and erosion rates under conservation agriculture, the open diamonds. And it shouldn't be much of a mystery if you followed what Playfair was saying, that the soil production data globally plots right on top of the geological erosion rate globally. Those should be about the same. What's unusual, and where the good news lies, is that conservation agriculture plots right on top of the long-term rates of geological erosion when viewed this way globally. In other words, the problem is not that we farm. The problem is how we farm. We can farm using techniques that will preserve the soil. The problem, of course, is that's called alternative agriculture. Well, let me give you a couple, there's one last example of the rates before I sort of move into a bit of a change and try and wrap up. This is essentially the medians or means, the average values for the data that I was just showing you. So whether you prefer the median or the mean, depending on how you want to argue about the forms of the distributions, take your pick. It's all up there. But the conventional agricultural erosion, plow-based agriculture, it results in erosion rates somewhere greater than 1.5 millimeters, greater than 1 millimeter a year. Whereas erosion rates under no-till agriculture, conservation agriculture, native vegetation, rates of soil production, long-term geological erosion rates, it's somewhere less than 1/10 of a millimeter a year. Any way you cut it, there's about at least 1 millimeter a year difference between rates of conventional agricultural erosion and any conceivable rates of soil production. And I'm not going to try and argue to you that I can parse the differences between any of those blue numbers. I think the big difference is between the red ones and the blue ones. But if you take that conclusion, that there's net soil erosion under conventional plow-based agriculture on the order of 1 millimeter a year or so, this implies that erosion of a typical 0.5 meter to 1 meter thick hillside soil could occur in roughly 500 to 1,000 years. That's approximately the lifespan of most major civilizations, at least through the fuzzy glasses of a geologist. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. In other words, I think that agricultural soil erosion could limit the lifespan of civilizations, and that is a lesson that we ignore at our own peril. Now, conversely, as I advertised in the caveats at the start, I'm not arguing that soil erosion per se wiped out whole societies, because very few people actually get killed by soil erosion. You know, the unfortunate drunk that falls face first into a field that during the wet season might be killed by soil erosion. But but that's not what I'm trying to argue. What I am trying to argue is that if you think about human history as having sort of a long period wavelengths of rising civilizations and declining civilizations, that the health of the land and the way that people have treated their soils and how much soil you have left helps to influence those long-term trajectories. And that may essentially be equivalent to loading the gun on taking out a civilization. But what actually pulls a trigger might be a drought, might be the neighbors that invade to try and take over your land, might be a failed attempt to take over the neighbor's land. Other things may be the triggers that actually formally end a society, but the health of the land is essentially foundational to the process. Well, again, I'm not the first person to suggest these ideas. Walter Loudermilk 50 years ago wrote that here in a nutshell, so to speak, we have the underlying hazard of civilization. For by clearing and cultivating sloping lands, for most of our lands are more or less sloping, we expose soils to accelerated erosion by water or by wind. And in doing this, we enter upon a regime of self-destructive agriculture. I think Loudermilk's words are as important today as they were 50 years ago, and that it's all the more important that we pay attention to them this time around. What could we do to reinvest in our agricultural soils? Well, we could reduce subsidies for conventional erosive farming practices. If you look at the way that modern farming subsidies are structured, we're actually encouraging people to engage in agricultural practices that are not in humanity's long-term best interest. Secondarily, we could increase support for no-till practices or other conservation soil management practices on lands where they are suitable. I have colleagues who argue that no-till agriculture, which is farming without the plow, sort of plowing through the crop stable from last year, sticking seeds into the ground and trying to emulate more natural processes, can be done on any land. I'm not sure everyone would agree with that. But we could actually support farmers adopting those practices. And we could promote practices that increase soil organic matter, both to sequester carbon and to help improve soil fertility. There's real opportunities there. As of 2009, as of about last year, more than half of humanity lives in cities. And therefore, the problem of feeding the world is not simply a rural one anymore. Both city and urban dwellers depend on soil, as well as do people in the rural environments. And restoring life to soils really is the key to maintaining life above ground. If we look at essentially what sets soil fertility in the natural environment, it's the life within the soil, the microbes, the organisms, the cycling of nutrients, the breakdown of rock and old organic matter to create the building blocks for new life. And if we look at the problem of building soil, I personally ran into the ironic problem or conclusion that as I was writing this book about how the way people treated land led to the downfall of society after society after society, my wife was quite literally restoring the yard around me. I'd sit at the backyard picnic table writing drafts of this book, and she essentially had taken soil that was essentially very organic-free glacial till soil and breathed new life into it and essentially restored life in our yard. And you may not be able to see it up there, but that sort of upper inch of dark brown stuff, that's what she's able to do in terms of just 5 years of organic farming in our yard and converting the soil into stuff that is much more fertile. And if we think about the problem of building soil, it's really surprising to me that we can build soils faster than we destroy them. And it's all an effort in terms of what are the keys? Labor and organic matter. What are the two things that the urban poor have? Labor and organic matter. Cities produce a lot of organic waste, and cities by definition have a lot of people. We could rethink the way that we actually treat soils in cities, as well as in the rural environments, and to think about soil restoration, rebuilding healthy soils on the planet, as really one of the keys to addressing some of the major challenges of the 21st century. Now, I'm not arguing that creating healthy, fertile soils is a silver bullet for the problems of climate change, public health, and feeding the world, but it certainly could be a secret weapon. It could be a foundational approach for making progress on all three because they are interconnected. In terms of soil and climate change, there's a huge potential to store carbon in soils globally. About a third of the carbon that's been added to the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution came from degraded soil organic matter, mostly from plowing the American Midwest and the Russian steppes. At least that much carbon could be put back in the ground because it used to be there, but it would require changing our farming practices. We can also add organic matter back to the soils through something that's called biochar, essentially adding charcoal to the soils, turning organic waste into relatively inert charcoal. Putting that back in the soil can not only hide carbon below ground for long periods of time, but also help to restore fertility to soils that have been degraded. Well, in terms of soils and urban green space, well, especially in cities, people need contact with nature for good mental health. There's been a number of studies in the last decade that have started to make those connections, and there's been innovations in terms of trying to bring green space and nature back into cities. What's the key? Healthy soil. Even in the spaces in between the buildings, on top of the buildings perhaps in places, but treating the soils in cities in ways that promote healthy soil is the key to gaining all the advantages of having green space in cities. In terms of soils and food, what we eat and how much we move greatly influence public health, and community food gardens, backyard gardens, and school gardens can help provide a city with fresh whole foods. You're probably not going to be able to feed a city entirely with urban agriculture, but the potential to greatly increase food production and bring it into the cities where people now live is huge. And if anyone's listening to the radio this morning, KUOW was talking about the city of Seattle's efforts in the urban agricultural region. Common element, again, healthy soil ensures a successful food garden. Restoring life to soils is the key. In terms of soils and physical activity, well, actually working a garden is labor intensive. It is hard work. But that can also connect people with nature, connect people with each other, and help in terms of public health problems by encouraging physical activity and exercise. In terms of feeding the world, the last of the three great challenges of the 21st century that I'll address in this talk, I was really surprised in doing the background research for DIRT to learn the number of studies that have argued that crop yields from no-till and organic agriculture can become pretty close to matching, sometimes exceed, sometimes not quite get to those of conventional agriculture. And by this I mean not just conventional plow-based agriculture, but traditional chemical-intensive agriculture. The potential for organic agriculture to feed the world has been, I think, unfairly overlooked in many circles, particularly some policy circles at the highest levels of our society. But if you think like a geologist and think 50 or 100 years out, how we're going to feed ourselves in a post-petroleum world, restoring soil fertility could be one of the keys to maintaining high agricultural outputs in a world where cheap fertilizers are no longer an option because we've essentially either run out of cheap fossil fuels or we've evolved ways to try and manage their release into the atmosphere for other reasons. Finally, in terms of feeding the world, is it really a reasonable argument to argue that the key to feeding hungry people would be to sell them fertilizers or genetically modified seeds? No, I would argue that the key to feeding people who have no money is teaching them how to farm, giving them access to land, and giving them the ability to grow food themselves using the labor and organic matter that they actually have access to. Will Allen, the NBA star who turned farmer, whose passion is urban agriculture, was in town not too long ago and basically told me, give me 5 acres in the city and I'll outproduce a conventional 20-acre farm. You can grow more food per hectare on land within the city than with conventional farming if you do it right. And Will has done it. He's demonstrated it. Well, so this leads me to propose essentially a gardener's recipe that essentially is the heart of a new book, a sequel to Dirt, that my wife and I are working on, arguing that reviving urban soils is essentially a necessary thing to do for healthy cities and healthy communities in the coming century. Healthy soil really is the foundation upon which public and environmental health is built. It all starts at the ground beneath our feet. This also applies to rural agricultural settings, but if we can learn how to restore soils in cities, doing it in a rural environment will present less of a challenge in some ways. So finally, in the January, I think, start of the year edition of Nature, I called for what I call a greener revolution, rethinking agriculture globally. Since the dawn of history, humanity has degraded soils. We've essentially mined soil for our existence, and quite profitably and well. But this century, we're at a turning point that will set the course of humanity for the next millennium. We need to rethink our relationship with the land. The challenge, as I see it, is actually really quite simple. If we're to sustain life at the top, us, we must reinvest in life at the bottom, life in and of the soil itself, if we think about our future in a post-petroleum world, a century out. Well, how do we start? Well, it's a big challenge. But there's actually no place to start like home. There's the potential to actually restore soils on a small scale and have individual actions add up to a large scale is huge. My wife is growing about 1/3 of our food, as I can roughly calculate, on our lot and not using a whole lot of space. The garden that she's developed over the last 8 years, I calculated, is sequestering, perhaps about 1 ton of carbon a year. That's not our entire carbon footprint, but we've made efforts to try and limit ours, and that's accounting for, maybe 1/4 of our annual carbon footprint. And we didn't realize we were doing it. Imagine if everyone was essentially trying to restore soils and a movement grew to actually treat land differently. We need to learn how to do that over the next century, and there's no place to start like home. A lot of change can start from the ground up. But I encourage you to think about soils differently. They're dynamic systems. They're things that can change, both for the better and for the worse. As Chris is talking about, one of my favorite quotes on this regard is from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who wrote that a nation that destroys its soils destroys itself. But I'll submit to you that we have the opportunity to rebuild soils. We don't have to repeat the experience of prior societies. In fact, given that we're an integrated global culture, we need not to repeat the experience. We need to relearn or to learn a new way to relate to the land, to actually invest in life in the soil so that we leave the land in better shape than we actually got it in, because that's how we'll actually build a truly sustainable society that a geologist like myself could argue had a chance of making it over the long run. So this is a very interesting century to be alive in. It is pivotal, and I encourage you all to think about the land, perhaps a little bit differently. And I thank you very much for your attention, and I'll wrap it up there.